Let's start again with the introductions. I'm Matt Cross, I'm a senior business analyst at Audacia. I joined around 2 years ago, working primarily in consulting. A big part of that role is working alongside clients during the early stages of projects, where the objective is to define the scope of projects and build the foundations in discovery before we then pass that across to a delivery team. Prior to working at Audacia, I have around a decade of experience in BA and product roles in the software industry. That includes sectors like social care and education, commercial property, and services to the public sector. So what's today's talk about then? It's about Lego. Well, sort of. One of the coolest things about consulting is that we get to speak to businesses across many industries and learn all about the things they do and work out how technology can help address the challenges they're facing. The idea behind this talk came from a realization that we often see those same challenges repeat themselves across industries when they approach a new project. That might be concerns about delivering value efficiently. It might be that they want advice on prioritizing the right things. It might be about how best to engage their teams and keep them on side during that project. This talk then is about some of those common requirements issues and some approaches and techniques that we found to be particularly effective in addressing them. And yeah, it's also about Lego, because I often think that I'd like my job quite a bit more if I was being paid to talk about Lego. So for one day at least with this tech talk, it's kind of true. On to our building challenges then, which I'll introduce properly. Today we're going to be tasked with replacing our existing Lego castle. The one we've got no longer fits the needs of the kingdom, so we need a new one to replace it. On this journey, we'll be going through 3 different problems that we might have to overcome as we define those castle's requirements. These are stacking wisely, the picture on the box, and all hands on bricks. Stacking wisely is all about scope management techniques and how to prioritize effectively to make sure that the first release, or our minimum viable castle, as we'll be calling it, is a success. In the picture on the box, we know what we want that finished castle to look like, but we don't have the instruction manual to get us there. So I'll be talking through some visualization techniques that we can use in requirements definition to produce that clear, logically structured backlog of requirements. The final scenario, all hands on bricks, is all about the stakeholders we might meet during our build and some things we can do to ensure that everyone's aligned and engaged to help us achieve our goals. Stacking wisely then. In this challenge, we've completed a period of discovery. We've spoke with all the different guild members and people in the court within the castle to produce our backlog of requirements. This is our shopping list of things that we'd like the castle to have. But how do we know which things on that shopping list are needed for the first version of that for our MVC, and why can't we just have them all? Perhaps we've not got the budget for the set that we'd really like, so we've got to prioritize based on cost. Similarly, maybe we're under a tight deadline to build the set, and we need to prioritize delivering specific key features quickly. Even if the king says that no expense should be spared, aiming to deliver everything now is probably going to be a bad idea. Things that we're talking about now can seem great in concept, but it's only when you come to use that in practice that you know if it really works or if it could have been designed in a more efficient way. So it's best usually to start small and then let real user feedback shape what priorities we put in place for the future work. But another way on that last point, are you sure your son and daughter even like Lego castles? Best to test the water before we go all in on that big set. Solutions we'll be talking about to address this. We need to start by understanding what the problem is that we're trying to solve. We need to understand what else is important. Then we need a clear way to apply that to our requirements so we can prioritize and agree what a successful castle will look like for that MVC. So we've got our list of requirements, but how do we decide which ones make the cut for the first release? Which will concentrate on only the most essential things. We'll start by making sure that our decision makers are in agreement on what the problem is we're trying to solve, so that everyone's got the same high level of understanding of what that scope will be. I like to do this by asking 3 questions. Who's experiencing the problem? What is their problem? And why does that problem matter? I like this method for its simplicity, but there are many other techniques for defining problem statements if there is another one that you find works better for you. If we apply those 3 questions to our castle, we can learn that who's experiencing the problem, the merchant guild and market traders. The problem is that the castle market can't add new stalls as the foundations are too weak to support further expansion. And the problem that causes is that the castle can't attract new travellers to the market, which causes us to experience lost influence and opportunities. Or if we put that in software product terms, the product design and sales teams can't add new product ranges because the existing system is too unstable for additional features. And that's causing them to have lost sales opportunities and an ongoing inability to respond to market demand. Expressed as a sentence, we can see that there are other ways to output that same statement if we prefer this to bullet points. The key thing that we're trying to do is define what the immediate problem is in clear terms that gives decision makers an immediate objective that we can focus on. We can then use that as a litmus test during prioritization for individual requirements. So, for example, I can rule a feature that would make the castle dungeon darker and colder out of our MVC, as it's not relevant to solving that immediate issue. Cautionary tale. While defining that problem in simple terms is critical, it's not usually a good idea to make that the only criteria for assessing scoping requirements. It's possible that that could result in lower upfront costs, maybe it results in a quicker delivery. But what often happens next is that even if that product ticks the boxes, there's still a good chance it will fail. Yes, we've got a Lego castle, we can see the market square is bigger, but maybe the gates into that market square are too small, so there's a bottleneck, giving all the small folk a poor shopping experience as they come and go. Perhaps your design has placed the castle blacksmith's forge deep in the foundations, but what if the king finds a better blacksmith and wants to switch to use their services in 6 months' time? The upshot of that is that oversimplifying can result in a product that's hard to build upon, difficult to scale and frustrating to use, and it will need to be rebuilt again soon, or user adoption will drop because we've not considered the broader needs of the organization. To illustrate this further, let's take a look at a feature that we might want to add to our castle, and how what appears to be the same thing at a high level can vary by quite a lot in complexity. So a problem statement alone is unlikely to give much of a steer on whether the smallest version of this feature will suffice, or do we need to add some of that additional functionality from some of the medium and large buckets. Which brings us on to how we consider what else is important when we come to deliver a project. Maybe the smallest version of that feature we've just looked at is fine. Perhaps we've not got any ambitions for expanding the castle in the near future, or maybe this castle is just a stopgap while we wait for the King's Grand Palace to be completed. Alternatively, if the castle is going to be a long-term investment for the business, we might consider adding some richer features from that previous list for quality of life improvements today, or with an eye on some of the extensions that we might want to include tomorrow. Because ideally, we'll be able to deliver those extensions without having to knock down and rebuild what we're working on today. But how do we make good decisions about what we prioritize, and how do we do that consistently across the project? Something I've seen work well is to define a set of principles. So this would be a short list of phrases that clarify the things that are important to the project's success. These can be more like guidelines than rules, and not every principle needs to apply to every single feature. The idea is that these principles will help steer where you can and can't cut corners during your MVC. And it's normal for these to be less direct than the problem statement, and a little bit more subtle in their influence. Think of them as guidelines rather than hard rules. If we return to that feature we've just been looking at, we can see how some of those principles we had on the last slide might apply to tell us what other things we might want to include here. Knowing that our future plans include plans to add an events module, so the Master of Arms can host jousting events, we might want to consider adding more beds to the infirmary, because jousting events is probably going to mean more injured knights. I also know that the Merchant Guild are very happy to share their sales data for the market among themselves, but they wouldn't want the Tawny Knife to be able to see this. So we may need to also consider role-based access controls as part of that first build. So we can see that how principles that might not influence the features we see today can also help steer architectural decisions towards our long-term objectives. The last thing I want to talk about in stacking wisely is how we can simplify prioritization. We've spoken about some of the things that we should be looking for in features that are part of our MVC, but what we need to do now is prioritise those requirements, so we've got a clear, defined scope that we can use to tell us if our plans for this project is viable based on the cost and time that will be needed to deliver it. In agile software delivery, I think there can always be a tendency when prioritisation is mentioned to go straight towards Moscow. This is an exercise that will sort each feature that we have into one of 4 categories, where it's either a must, a should, must, should, could, or won't. It's useful as it tells us both what we need to have as an absolute must, but it also gives us a feel for the relative value of the non-essential items as well. And when we're delivering in Agile, all the projects that we do should account for a portion of should and could features in the budget. So that gives us some flexibility in the delivery, rather than only having capacity to deliver the musts and nothing else. But it's not essential for us to be able to work out our overall budget to know what those should and could features are up front. Initially, all we need to know are the musts that are essential for that first release to be a success, and then we can work out how much budget we will have for should and could features as a secondary step. I think as well that when you apply Moscow at that first point, then what we're really after are the must for the MVP is that it cannot be done properly. So must tend to be assigned correctly, but you may not apply the proper scrutiny to everything else, and it just all goes somewhere in the maybe pile. To solve this, I think there's value in simplifying that first cut of prioritisation to simply state if each feature is a yes or no for the MVC, and then we can apply Moscow to everything that's currently in that no bucket as a separate exercise. Once we've got the MVC list, we can work out the project budget based on our desired ratio of musts to should and coulds. And this both gives us the overall budget for the project and tells us how much of that budget is being put aside for delivering those should and could non-essential features. That means that we can also apply the won't categorization within Moscow correctly, which simply means that it's a no for this first phase, not an indefinite no. And we can be clear in stating that the proportion of features of should and coulds that we define do not exceed our budget within this phase for delivering them. So we can prioritize and challenge those things more effectively and avoid having a backlog that's comprised, on the one hand, of features that we plan to deliver as part of this release, and on the other hand, contains a vague wish list of things that we don't have any budget currently allocated to. That can be quite confusing for stakeholders who may still think that you're planning to deliver everything in the list. This way, by keeping the two things separate, it lets us be clear that when new requirements arise or priorities change during that delivery, you can present your overall backlog clearly as being fixed in capacity based on our known budget and timescales, and that before we can put anything new into that, we must first remove a feature or features of equivalent size from the list, which helps prevent that scope creep. Moving on to the picture on the box. As you've probably seen by now, I'm leaning into the Lego analogy quite heavily for this brick by brick theme. But Lego is not the only reason I like comparing software development to stacking bricks. Unlike a new building or a product that whirs along a factory conveyor belt, a piece of software isn't tangible in the sense that we can reach out and touch it. Yet, software development is as much a manufacturing industry as it is a services one. And I always like to picture that the products we're building as bricks being slotted into place as part of a bigger building. All of this is a very long-winded introduction to say that the picture on the box is about ways we can make our individual requirements more tangible so that we can picture not just that finished item, but each brick that we need to stack along the way to achieving it. The problem that we encounter in both greenfield development as we add details to a concept, and also in legacy replacement projects, where we've got an existing system to look at, but we don't have any instructions for building it anew. The tools we'll be looking at to address this are user story maps and wireframes. So let's move on to talk user story mapping. User stories, for the uninitiated, are the smallest level in which we define requirements in a backlog. As the name suggests, the purpose of each one is to tell the story of a specific user of our system, an action that they need to carry out, and the outcome this will help them achieve. They exist in a wider three-tier hierarchy of requirements below epics and features. The user story map then is an interactive visual aid for working our way down this pyramid from the top, where we start with our idea. We then have the epics, and then we go down to eventually to the most granular level so that we can define those individual components and where they fit in that bigger picture during our early requirements gathering sessions. So let's take a look at an example. We've got the picture on the box of our castle, and these epics we have on the screen here depict the high-level buckets of features that castle will need to include. As it's a castle, it needs to be secure from intruders. We know that market expansion is a key component, as that's the driver behind replacing our old castle. And we also want to add a Tony yard so that the castle can hold events and attract new visitors. Once we've got these high-level buckets, we can then drill down a level further and look inside our security one and start working out what the key processes and functions that we need to perform are in that area. These become our features, which sit in the middle between epics and user stories. In this example, as part of user management and authentication, we need to be able to manage both our internal and external users, and we want multi-factor authentication for logging in. When we move on to look at this user story map concept in action, we see it at user story level. We select a feature and then walk through what the business process is that feature will describe, and we create a user story for each of those key steps. As you can imagine, over a whole project, this is likely something that you'll work on iteratively over a large number of workshops, bringing in different subject matter experts as you need to. The greenfield requirements definition, it's an effective way to get users thinking about all the logical steps in your process, and writing them down and seeing that process laid out can often then prompt further discussion to challenge which steps are essential, as well as ideas for the functionality that could add value to the project. In this map, we've established a core journey for administration to be able to create and update staff user accounts, and for staff to be able to log in and reset their passwords. And then we've got, in that slightly different color on the bottom row, some additional film stories that are examples of things that might be useful but aren't necessarily part of that core pathway. When we apply a user story map to a legacy replacement, it might take a slightly different pathway, as the starting point there for understanding requirements is often to take a look at the system that's already in place. There's an additional challenge with legacy replacement as well, where not only does that new castle need to do the things that we want it to do, it needs to also be able to do all the essential things that the existing castle does before we can move out and lock the doors. Defining the current castle's user journey as a user story map can help with that, because it becomes a tool for challenging those assumptions and processes that exist in our current system. So that when we eventually do move castle, we make sure that all the clutter we no longer need can go into the skip rather than the removal van, while still helping us take the things with us that we need. It's worth noting that those user story maps can be helpful in other tasks as well, like prioritization, for distinguishing must-have features from the shoulds and coulds, or the won'ts, and they can also be used in delivery planning to map out dependencies between features so you can plan a sensible order of delivery, but we'll save a more detailed look at those use cases for another time. I quite like using Figma as a tool for creating user story maps. Their product allows, with a free account, allows you to have up to 4 distinct projects at a time, and lets you share access to each of those with other stakeholders, which you can also say is set to be either read-only or editable. So you can all work on that together with other people. Wireframes are something that you may be familiar with, often as something that a UX engineer would produce to output high-level conceptual designs of the finished product. These can be quite detailed and take a lot of effort to produce. The wireframes I'm speaking about today are more basic ones, and some tools that we can use to quickly produce and refine them so they can add value to our requirements definition workshops. The user story maps we've just looked at are great for working out which bricks we need, but what happens if we want to put one of those bricks under a microscope? That's where wireframes can help. particularly for areas of the application where user interface and user experience are highly important components. An example of that in our castle is the market square, as that will be the first touch point for many of our visitors, and it needs to be easy to navigate through so that they can find the products they want to buy. In the example I'm about to show, rather than trying to capture what my stakeholders want through having discussions with them and then writing down a description of what we think that needs to be, I've taken their initial requirements and produced a wireframe that's output in HTML just from a few prompt sentences in ChatGPT. As an aside, GPT-4 has got a code interpreter tool that lets you generate and preview that code in the same page. If you don't have access to that particular element of GPT, you can still save that HTML as a file elsewhere and then preview it in another application. If you've got ambitions to be an amateur UX engineer, you can also create basic wireframes in design tools like Draw and once again Figma. They've got friendly interfaces for non-technical users. It probably will take a little bit longer than using chat, but it will ultimately give you more control over what the output is if that's something that you require. Let's take a look. In my marketplace, requirements workshop, even a simple wireframe like this with placeholders where icons will appear lets users understand and engage with what we're proposing so that we can critique and refine that design. For example, here, we can immediately see that the width of that design could be a problem for mobile devices, so we can discuss ways that could improve that as a mobile experience. We can also start to think about what the different user journeys will be of people accessing that page. This is great for someone who's coming to our site and just wants to see what kind of things our market can offer. But what about someone who knows exactly what they're looking for? Do we want to add a quick search and filter box at the top so that they can find specific products quickly? Taking wireframes beyond the requirements workshops with your stakeholders and into delivery with your internal teams, I've seen a number of colleagues use these things to really good effect on some of our recent projects. They will use the wireframes and make them part of the acceptance criteria in user stories. So they'll add the image to the story and tag it with reference points of the AC. That's received quite strong feedback from developers and testers here, as it makes it easy to interpret those UX-based requirements. For our final challenge, imagine that the whole family are intrigued by the idea of building our new castle. They all want to chip in and help with the build. It sounds pretty wholesome, but how do we manage if everyone's got a slightly different vision for how that castle will look? Your daughter just wants to play with all the figures. Your son's focused on building a tower of his own with all the fanciest pieces. And the dog decided to sit on the box and just wants to be the center of attention. I exaggerate, but that's what stakeholder management can sometimes feel like. In this nightmare event, the techniques we've discussed already might not be enough to save our end product from finishing up half-built with a crumpled box that means we can't take it back to the shop and start again. So what are some more realistic stakeholder challenges that we might face, and what can we do to foster alignment and good teamwork on those projects? Some common problems that we might encounter are that our stakeholders just have different views, assumptions, and expectations of what the project will deliver. It might be that some of those stakeholders have got gaps in knowledge or understanding about how we plan to do the delivery, which can cause blockages and inefficiencies. It might simply be that you're contributing to a large project with lots of people and moving parts to manage, which is a challenge in and of itself. The solutions I'll discuss here will relate to how we can build rapport with the delivery team, suggestions for a consistent approach to knowledge sharing so that stakeholders are up to date and aligned on our expectations during discovery. And I'll finish the talk with a quick strategy for managing different stakeholder groups and capturing their requirements for the rebuild of our castle. Think about some of the different stakeholders that you might encounter on a project. They'll all have tangible roles and responsibilities within that project, but as a layer below that, they may have different motivations and concerns that can have an impact. Some of them will love their old castle. It does what they need it to do, they're proud of it, and changing it is quite an upheaval to them. You might have a group who are more interested in space exploration, so they'd rather the organization prioritize building a space shuttle. Some of them may just have a negative perception of Lego from their past projects and be a little bit skeptical about your ability to deliver this one successfully. Some others might be new to Lego completely, and they won't know what's possible or where to start, so they'll need some more support. We don't have the power to fix all of these things or alleviate negative perceptions 100% of the time, but we can try our best by being aware of some of these motivations and adapting our approach as needed. In most projects, it's likely that you're going to have regular meetings with product owners, subject matter experts, and others, and those become much easier if you can foster good working relationships with those people for that during that time. It might not be a one-size-fits-all approach to this, but good face-to-face or screen-to-screen communication is an important skill. It can often be as simple as taking a few minutes at the start of your meeting to ask how people's weekends were, share a little bit of what you've been up to. Stop to think about those interactions in meetings that you have frequently from more of a commercial empathy perspective. Then if those sessions are often too business-like or communication can feel strained for you, it's likely it does for those other people as well. And at worst, that could be a barrier to that person or group choosing to work with you again in the future. When you first meet people, or for kickoff meetings, it helps if you prepare some icebreakers beforehand, especially if that's a session that you'll be leading. It's a simple way to get everyone in the meeting speaking and contributing from the get-go. During introductions at project kickoffs, I might ask each person to share what most excites them about the project and what do they see as the biggest risk to its success. You can reshape those as needed. For example, if it's a legacy system replacement, I might ask about the best feature and biggest pain point of their existing product. It can give you some insight into that person and their role and trigger follow-up questions that will help you get to know them better. More importantly, it gets everyone contributing early, which sets a better tone for the meeting than having one or two dominant speakers, because that can often be a cue for other people in the session to go into receiver mode, put their headsets on mute, and not really engage in the session. Linked to that, because I think a big part of a BA or product role when you're running those workshops is to facilitate discussions and make sure that everyone who attends is contributing to that discussion. A lot of things might influence how much or little each person is speaking within a meeting, but there will be scenarios where someone is being a little bit quieter, but you know that they work in an area that is affected and influenced by that particular requirement. So I would say that not to move on without asking them directly for their input on that particular item. If you phrase questions in a more general fashion to the wider group, it's unlikely to draw someone out who's not contributing already. But if you call someone by name, Seb, how would this workflow change impact your team? Then you're more likely to get that engagement that you want. Consider as well that this castle, once it's built, will become the user's system. So you want the people that are contributing to its design to feel a sense of ownership for it, and helping out in those workshops can certainly be a good way to do that. To ensure that stakeholders are aligned on our projects on the expectations and objectives, we need a consistent and repeatable way to share the key information about the project with them. At the outset of that, consider things like what would have been useful for my stakeholders to know before we get started. I often think the best suggestions for that come from experience, and retrospective meetings from your earlier projects can be particularly useful to feeding to what you share at the start of the next one. Some good examples that I've encountered include things like having a project wiki or document store that everyone can access with pages detailing some of those things. You might have things like the problem statement and principles that we discussed earlier, glossaries of relevant product or industry terminology, user roles within the application, and a summary of what each of those roles does. As things progress, you can add guidance for things like UAT testing. And if you've got stakeholders who are unfamiliar with agile delivery, it can help to plan an introductory session with them at the start of the project that just runs through what agile is, what the key terms are, so that they're up to speed when you're running through those things on meetings. So they understand how to use your backlog management system, whether that's Azure DevOps, Jira, or something different. If not, it can help as well to provide all your stakeholders with some basic user training that covers the system navigation and how they can do the tasks that they'll need to carry out. Something I like to do as well with that is configure user dashboards in that system that can show how we're progressing towards our goals. And I'll include them query tiles with things like shortcuts on there as well that will help them get to what they're looking for more quickly. Ideally, all of that will be made easy to access in a repeatable way with minimal effort, so that everyone that's coming onto the project can revisit that as they need to, or if new stakeholders join partway through, we can get them up to speed quickly. It's always worth recording things like those introductory training sessions so you're not having to repeat them later, or that some people don't miss out if they can't attend on that day. Back to our castle rebuild. In the castle, there are lots of different groups of inhabitants performing different functions in different areas. Part of our task is to speak to all of those groups, understand their wants and needs, while we define those initial requirements. So I'll finish the talk with a quick example of how we might approach this challenge. The objective in requirements discovery is to get from each of those teams a list of their user-driven requirements, which will help us make decisions and prioritize, and we'll filter that into a backlog of features that will form our minimum viable castle. We know that some of those groups love the current castle, some are hungry for change and have lots of great ideas that they think can drive their area forwards, and others might just be a bit concerned about the wider impact of this change will have for them all. But putting the motivations to aside for a minute, our immediate challenge is to overcome the scale of this task and the sheer number of workshops and individuals and people that we need to capture requirements from, with a finite amount of time to do this task. So we need a clear structured approach to achieving this goal. So how can we do that? We'll start by identifying the different groups of subject matter experts that we need to speak with, so we can have focused workshops with each of those teams. We will need to have a structure for the workshops. My plan will be that when I speak to each team initially, I want to have clear separation between the discussions for their as-is needs that the system does today, to distinguish it from the wish list of enhancements that they'd like to add in future. I benefit from doing it that way, as it's likely that our first release will be taking a lot more from the as-is pile than the enhancements, and it makes it easy for me to understand where that distinguishment lies. If we think about those stakeholders' motivations again, it helps them too. It can be reassuring for any of those that are worried that we're not just looking to rip out functionality that they've got today, as we're directly focusing discussions on what they need to keep. It can ring-fencing time for innovation as a separate task, also helps those who've got ideas for change feel more involved, as it shows that we value their ideas to listen to them. It also helps manage those people's expectations, that it may not be possible to deliver all of those enhancements on day one. If we start by discussing as-is and new things side by side, there's a risk of them getting the impression that we plan to deliver all those things on day one, which isn't usually the case. We've got a lot of things to cover in those initial discussions, so I want to focus on capturing high-level information, just basically what the requirement is, and some high-level context as to why they need it. That lets us get a feel for the size of each area of the castle quite quickly, and then we can spend more time on any areas of complexity or risk where we've got less certainty moving forwards. Once we've got all those different teams' requirements, I'll want to give each of them a chance to review and feedback on what we've captured so that we can make those changes. Following those steps should put us in quite a strong position to then go and review what we've captured with management. As a final point, it can help to complete that exercise I've just discussed in a separate backlog to the one that we're going to use for delivery. We want this backlog to be structured in a way that's easy for each team to understand, i.e. we might just have an epic with features in there that are the shopping list of each of those teams. It can become a little bit messy with overlapping requirements if we're trying to do that as a proper agile backlog for delivery. It also lets, keeping the two things separate, also lets management discuss and apply priorities that we don't make visible to some of those individual teams, which might be a need in some cases. Once we've agreed that scope, we can then carry forward the features that will be included and use some of the other techniques we've discussed to map out what that will look like in delivery. That brings us to the end of our brick by brick challenges. The challenge in itself gauging what level to pitch these kinds of talks at, but I hope everyone who's attended today has at least found a few details there and quite useful and things that you can take away to help with future projects. As a very quick recap, we've learned how to define our problem and what's important to prioritize effectively. We've discussed some helpful tools to help us define requirements, and we've learned how good communication and structure are key to aligning stakeholders in discovery. I'll take a look at some questions before we finish, but first, just wanted to give you a quick reminder that our next talk is 4 weeks today, which is the 27th of March. and it will be our technical director, Richard Brown, delivering a talk about capturing and measuring feedback from your software engineers. The sign-up link to that is already published on our events page, so please head over and get signed up if that's something that is of interest. I do apologise. I have gone a bit crazy with the slideshow there. Let's go back to our questions. Have we got any questions coming through? Got one here. Asking about in stacking wisely, where we mention using principles to guide where we can and can't cut corners. But what if applying one of those principles in the way that you'd like to is going to be beyond your budget? I would say for that, the principles that we define exist to highlight what's important to the delivery. And it's possible that you'll need to be flexible so that you can compromise on them, even on the principles in some places. I'd say the advantage is having those principles in the first place, at least, is that it can make you aware of what those issues are early in your project so that you can discuss what options are available and the likely impact. Just take one more. I'm conscious that we are tight for time. What things might you change in your approach when factoring in the motivations of different stakeholders? I think that one's quite tough to say because it is very much a situation by situation type thing. But sometimes it might just be about being a little bit more tactful in what you say. If it's a legacy replacement and someone's fond of the existing system, I'm not going to give strong opinions about that application one way or the other. Too negative, and they're not going to respond to me. If I'm gushing with praise about it, they might use that as ammunition to take away elsewhere to back up their resistance to changing that, making that change. I think it can also be worth there recognizing things like a person's preferred communication methods. If I've got a list of questions about requirements that I need to speak to one subject matter expert about, but I know that they're absolutely stacked and have a lot of plates spinning, I might just try and find a time for a meeting to cover those all at once, rather than tag them in 10 DevOps cards so that they've got different emails popping in that they need to action separately. I just want to say thank you again for joining us and my ineptitude with slides in places. But yeah, that's been really good. Have a good afternoon. Take care.